Hello everybody, this is Grandmaster Robert Hungaski for chesslecture.com, and today I wanted to continue the discussion on this strategic theme of the good bishop against the bad bishop. Now, in my last video, I discussed an exceptional case where the bad bishop wasn't actually so bad. In fact, the title of the lecture that I witnessed, and then that's where I got the material from, was called The Good Thing About the Bad Bishop. So I guess here we could flip that on its head and say the bad thing about the bad bishop, because now I want to show a couple of examples of why the bad bishop is actually bad more than the exceptions where it's actually a useful piece. So this example is taken from a very famous Endgame book called Endgame Strategy by Mikhail Cherysheevsky, and it's a great illustration of why a bad bishop is actually bad. Now, in my previous lecture, we had discussed some exceptions where the bad bishop was actually a very useful piece because it protected all of the weaknesses, allowing all the other pieces to thrive and to look for active posts. Now, the problem here is that Black is going to have to assume a bad bishop, but he's got no other pieces to make up for it. So after the move bishop to b5, we're going to see that White's bishop is clearly superior because of two important reasons. And I think these two principles should be at the core of any good bishop against bad bishop evaluation. So what makes a good bishop good? Right? First of all, it is not restricted by its own pawns. So if we have a light squared bishop, we want pawns on dark squares. That's easy enough. And almost everybody knows this part. But the second part, and this is a little bit trickier, is that for a bishop to be good, you also need that bishop to have targets that it can sink its teeth into. It's not enough just to have a bishop that moves freely across the board. If it doesn't have targets that it can attack, it's just going to be like a ghost that's haunting the board but not really getting anywhere, right? So this light squared bishop that White has is a very good bishop because now it's heading towards the e8 square from where it's going to sink its teeth into this vulnerable f7 pawn. Now, Black's bishop is bad for two reasons as well, right? First of all, it's restricted by its own pawns, and secondly, it doesn't have any targets that it can sink its teeth into. So we're going to see that this is going to be enough for White to win the game. The irony of the Cherysheevsky book is that he argued, okay, the logical move would be for Black to play bishop to e6. And after bishop to e8, then let's say Black is in a sort of zugzwang, which is going to be one of the main tactical tools at your disposal when you're trying to win a good bishop against bad bishop endgame. We'll see that zugzwang and triangulation are going to be two recurring themes whenever you're trying to impose a good bishop, whether it's against a bad bishop or a bad knight. That's also a very interesting topic for future lectures, the good bishop against the bad knight. So now after king e7, which would be the only move to avoid zugzwang, the bishop switches its focus to the other target and starts aiming at the d5 pawn. So after king d6, now bishop b7, and now the king no longer has any useful tempi. So in this position, it seems like Black has to resign. But Cherysheevsky argued, well, hold on a minute. Can I try to set up a fortress with pawn to f6? Sacrificing a pawn, and after g takes f6, then bishop to f7. And now Black is just going to waste tempi with the bishop, whether it's g8, f7, or e6. All of a sudden, the bishop has much more movement now. However, he concludes, well, but no, not really, because this bishop is going to be able to really shuffle across the board and always sink its teeth into one target or another from one square or another. So all that White has to do now is reroute the bishop to the a2 g8 diagonal and prepare the move e4, winning a second pawn, and that will crack Black's position. So for example, now after bishop to c8, bishop g8, for example, bishop g4, bishop f7, for example, then the bishop will come back to d1, here, here, and okay, if black wastes a tempo, we can waste a tempo, and then when the bishop moves e4, and the game is over. Fair enough, right? Well, Cheryshev says no, doesn't stop there. He says this looks like an easy win for white with this maneuvering of the bishop, but the endgame is a draw, he concludes. If black, instead of playing bishop e6, plays a different bishop move, let's say like bishop to f5, and only meets bishop e8 with bishop e6. Why is this so important? Well, because now we are not the ones in Zugzwang. We are not the ones that need to find a useful move here, and we are not going to play king e7, allowing the light squared bishop to get rerouted to b7 and put pressure on d5. So it seems like now it's white that's in Zugzwang and doesn't have any useful moves. In fact, the only move for white here to try to put black in a tough spot would be pawn to b3. And now this forces black once again to enter the variation king e7, bishop c6, king d6, and bishop b7. However, now black can play f6. And after g takes f6, bishop f7, and the position is now quite different, because if you play for this same idea of rerouting your bishop, you're going to find that, wait a minute, all of a sudden now one of your pawns is interfering with your bishop. So you don't have access to the a2, g8 diagonal, and our bishop is less good than it was before, and therefore Cheryshev concludes that the endgame is now a draw. Now you would think that would be the end of the story. But many years later, Alexander Belyavsky, one of the best players of his day, came back to this endgame and he said, no, Cheryshev was so close, but he just needed to go one move further here and make that b3 square accessible to the bishop once again by playing, let's say after bishop g8, b4, sacrificing the b pawn and making the a2, g8 diagonal accessible to the bishop once again. And for example, if bishop e6, bishop a2, and black is in Zugzwang, right? Whether you move the king or the bishop, now white gets to play pawn to e4, and the endgame is just over, right? White is going to take on d5, and he's going to trade into a winning king and pawn endgame. So this is an interesting example that I think illustrates some basic principles of good bishop against bad bishop endgames. Now we're going to move on to a second example, and we're going to take it up a level of complexity. So let's examine the following position. If we have to compare it to the previous example, how would we evaluate black's light squared bishop? Would it be worse? Would it be just as bad? Or would it be slightly better? Well, this position is less delicate for black because some of the bad pawns, you could say, like these pawns that are on light squares, are not fixed. So they have the potential to get moved to dark squares. So black has a clear plan here. If black is able to get his pawns to f6 and g5, then he will only really need to tend to the d5 and b5 pawns, which he should be able to do without too much trouble. So black has a clear plan that will guarantee him a draw. Therefore, white needs to play very accurately here, or the advantage could quickly slip away. For example, a move like bishop e2, kind of a lazy move, trying to maneuver the bishop to f3 maybe, would simply allow black to play f6, and now if g4, g5 with an easy draw. If we tried to play g4 right away, counting on the fact that after bishop takes g4, bishop takes b5, would likely lead to a winning endgame, then black will play g5 once again and f6. And lastly, a move like h3, here it might be a little tricky to play g5, because after f takes g5, h takes g5, white might be able to create, well, no, actually, white will be able to create an outside passer. And that would be a huge accomplishment for white, and it would lead to a winning position. So maybe h3 would seem like an appealing move. But all of a sudden, we see that black has an alternative to putting pawns on dark squares, and he can actually just close down the king side and play something like h5 followed by f5. And it is ugly for sure, but it is also a fortress. And black will always be able to waste tempi with his bishop and avoid zugzwang. So the key here is we still can't treat this endgame as a pure good bishop against bad bishop, because we cannot define a bishop as bad until his pawns are fixed on the same color square as that bishop. So white's key move is h4. Now, this is, first of all, set out to prevent the move g5, so preventing the pawn from getting to a dark square. And secondly, if the bishop were to move, the bishop has to protect b5 at all times. So if the bishop were to move, for example, to e8, the idea is to play the pawn to g4. And after the bishop moves again, then we want to put our pawn on g5. And this will have effectively fixed the black pawns of f7 and g6 on light squares. And thus we have finally made sure that this bishop is bad. And this is going to lead to something somewhat similar to the game. In fact, some of the analysis that I had here was that after g5, for example, takes bishop d7, now we're going to see a recurring idea that we saw in the previous example, where the bishop on d3 needs to find targets in order to be good, right? b5 seems like it's easily defended. So instead, after bishop to e2, bishop c6, bishop g4, bishop e8, f5, white starts to open up the king side, because the target that white really wants is that f7 pawn. So, for example, after g takes f5, bishop takes f5, bishop c6, bishop back to g4, and now the bishop is coming to h5, and we have that target that we want. For example, after bishop e8, bishop h5, we have the sought-after zugzwang position. Black has no useful moves. If the king moves, our king will invade, and if the bishop moves, we win the f7 pawn. So here, black is in zugzwang, right? The bishop can't go to d7, the king can't move, the bishop can't go to e8, so white wins. So we see that as soon as the good bishop has the target that it seeks, the game is just over. So let's see what happened in the game. Black didn't play this way. After pawn to h4, black saw the writing on the wall and decided, okay, we have to do something here. So played f5. By the way, there's another important alternative here, which would be h5, also stopping g4. And this gives white a wonderful pawn break here with f5. The point is always that if the bishop gets deflected from the defense of b5, white will take this pawn, and after something like bishop c2, bishop to e8, once again we see that this maneuver allows the bishop to attack d5, and otherwise white will simply play b5, bishop c6, or simply b6, deflecting the king as well. So black cannot afford to lose the b5 pawn, but after g takes f5, bishop e2, white will once again pick up the rook pawn and create an outside passer with an easily winning position. So h5 does not really solve any problems. So black played pawn to f5, and now the pawn break comes from the other side. Pawn to h5. Again, if g5, this is absolutely hopeless. After h6, white will queen. So the only move here is g takes h5. Can't go bishop e8 because then we just take on g6 and we take on b5. So after g takes h5, white played the quiet g3. And amazingly, black is once again in zugzwang here. This bishop has to defend both b5 and f5 simultaneously, so it cannot move. This king has to defend both c5 and e5 simultaneously, so it cannot move. The only move that black can play is h4, and after g takes h4, h5. So at least black has succeeded in putting the ball back in white's court and has avoided zugzwang for at least one more move. But now we are going to use the second tactical tool at our disposal, which is triangulation. So after h5, white played bishop e2, and now after bishop to e8, again the bishop has to defend both pawns, bishop to f1, wasting a key move. Now if bishop back to d7, white gets the triangulation complete and the zugzwang that he's looking for. Now once again, black cannot defend all fronts at the same time. So bishop d7 would be out of the question. Instead, black can try bishop c6, but now we are going to attack the d5 pawn and restrict the bishop to this diagonal and target h5. So black is now not going to be able to defend both of his pawns at the same time. Right, so after bishop b7, bishop f3, and black simply resigned. Okay, so now that we've started with an example where the pawns are already fixed and the bishop is bad, and we continued by looking at an example where it definitely seems like the bishop is going to be bad, but first we need to take the precautions of fixing the pawns on the light squares. Now we're going to look at a third and final example. And this is going to be a much more sophisticated endgame, where black is very, very close to having an easy draw. Compared to the two previous examples, black has done quite a bit of progress here, because we see that of all of black's 6 pawns, only 2 are on light squares, and most importantly, black has the c5 and e5 squares under control, so that could give his king a little bit more freedom than what we've been seeing in the last 2 examples, right? The king could be able to move and not allow the white king to invade through c5 or e5. Now, what is black's plan here? Well, if we were to play the natural move king to d4, black's idea is actually to play pawn to b5, counterintuitive move, because you would think, well, you don't want to put more pawns on light squares, you want to put more pawns on dark squares. But the point is that this b5 pawn is going to be easy to defend, and it's going to enable the b7 pawn to come to b6. So this bishop will easily be able to pivot back and forth and defend the b5 and d5 pawns, because they are so close to his pieces. This is not a problem. So this would be a draw. It's not a pretty position for black, but it'll get the job done. So now that we know the basic rules of good bishop against bad bishop endgames, we can start looking at ways of breaking them, because everybody knows the basic general principles, but what really allows you to become a master at chess is being able to recognize the exceptions. So in this position, white played the brilliant move pawn to a4. And instead of putting pawns on dark squares, white is going to start putting a lot of his pawns, almost all of his pawns, on light squares. And the idea is not just going to be to prevent b5, but rather to get our own pawn to b5, thus taking away the c6 square, and thus taking away this pivoting maneuver that black's light squared bishop usually relies on to defend the d5 pawn. Now, we'll see why it's so important for black to reroute that bishop to c6, because after the move pawn to g5, very logical move, now white plays king d4, since we don't have to worry about on to b5. Black played bishop to f7, and after bishop to f3, bishop to e6, pawn to f5, another pawn to a light square, bishop to f7, b4, bishop to e8, and b5. So now white's strategy is complete. White has gotten almost all of his pawns to light squares, but in the process he has dominated the black bishop and has restricted this bishop to a bad diagonal. Right? This bishop is going to have to defend d5. So now after bishop f7, we're going to see a familiar maneuver that we saw in the first example, where the bishop is going to get rerouted to the a2 g8 diagonal, and we are going to pin the d5 pawn and prepare the e4 pawn break. So now after bishop to d1, bishop to g8, bishop to b3, bishop to f7, e4, bishop g8, and here we need to be a little bit careful, because if we go e takes d5, after bishop f7, black is able to set up a fortress, and we see the big payoff of having placed so many pawns on dark squares. But after bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, well, this is what happened in the game, only that white wasted a move here with bishop to a2, repeated moves, and then took on d5. We see that after king to c7, it's not easy to break through, because if we try to go for the only other pawn break that we have, let's say with king to c4, after king d6, king b4, king takes d5, a5, pawn takes, king c5, not only are we making no progress, we're actually losing now. After b6, king c6, we're going to lose a pawn, we're going to lose the game. So if we simply go back, then black goes king c7, and it seems like black is holding. But here, white had a wonderful triangulation maneuver with king to c3, the distant opposition. Because now, after king d6, white can play king c4. And the idea is that if the king goes to c7, we gain a critical tempo in this pawn race. Before, with the king on d6, black would have already taken on d5. But now after king d6, a5, b takes a5, king takes a5, king takes d5, we're able to get our king into b6 just in time. And after king c4 takes, king c7, white will just gobble up all the kingside pawns, queen the f pawn. So black was not ready to throw in the towel quite yet. After king c4, instead he played the active move king to e5. It's critical to stay close to this d pawn. Now again, if king b4, king takes d5, and white needs to be careful, he's probably going to lose that again. So another wonderful move here, pawn to a5. The idea being that after b takes a5, forced, otherwise white will play a6. Now our king invades once again with king c5. And after a4, d6, b6, king c6, a3, d7, a2, d8, a1, queen d6 check, and king takes b6. And white is up a pawn, has pressure against f6, and is going to queen the b pawn very, very soon. So this game went on. I will include the entire game in the PGN, but white's position is completely winning, as you'll see in the analysis to the game. But I thought this was one of the nicest examples of the good bishop against bad bishop, because it basically breaks all the rules. And it is, even though it breaks all the rules, it's grounded on some very simple principles, right? So understanding how your opponent is trying to create a fortress, and then finding ways of interfering with that plan. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed these 3 examples. This has been Grandmaster Robert Hungaski for chesslecture.com.